Bringing Scott Bauer. He's our next guest. He's the CEO of Prosper Trading Academy. He's joining us this morning. Scott, welcome. No numbers during the break today coming out at 8:30 a.m. Eastern, but this week we have a few that are going to be closely watched. Later in the week, we've got some jobs numbers. We have the ADP, the Challenger, and then it's going to ramp up. Thursday, the jobless claims, the weekly number, and then Friday, non-farm payrolls and the monthly numbers. What are you going to be watching specifically and why?
To me, Ben, this week is a really important one in terms of where do we go with COVID and the reopening of some of the states here? Are we going to get data that suggests that, reopening done the right way is, not any worse off in terms of infections, in terms of deaths, unfortunately? Or are we going to see a spike? And I think the market is going to take its key from that data and not necessarily some of the economic data that's coming out.
Yeah, interesting. We were just talking with Stephanie a minute ago. I'm not sure if you heard, but about how RBOB, how gasoline could be one of those keys as well in terms of turning the lock and determining, if we're starting to see conditions better, especially with the weekly insight that they provide us. Let's talk about some of the other numbers that came out, because at the top of the show, I looked at the Euro manufacturing PMI, disappointing, 33.4. We talked about Hong Kong GDP coming in negative 5.3 year over year, 8.9% to the downside. But in addition to that, German and the Euro manufacturing numbers, we had German manufacturing PMI, Scott, the French manufacturing PMI. These numbers are coming in really weak across the board. I mean, a lot of people think that this could get worse before it gets better. Your thoughts?
I agree with that. However, the fact that we are just getting flooded with all these negative numbers, and they're not going to change, to the good side, to the plus side anytime soon. But the fact that
overnight,
we are getting
right.
Yeah, the fact that we're getting flooded with these numbers here, I think that I don't want to say we're in a bottoming process here, but when you look at the contrarian take on that, or kind of a buy the rumor, sell the news type of take on that, I don't see that as a negative. I think that's expected. These numbers that we're getting now, if we continue to get worse and worse and worse, that's obviously one thing, but I think these are numbers that are expected. I think the markets in whole, even the overseas markets, are taking it in stride. They're not selling off 5-10%. I mean, Hong Kong's not so great today because those are the worst numbers they've seen in forever, I think. But you know what? You would expect this contraction, and hopefully we start ticking up from here.
Yeah, Scott, you bring up a good point. Everybody's focused on the Hong Kong GDP and the negative 5.3. I mean, this is, I think, comes after, I mentioned at the top of the show, something like 12 or 13 months in a row of retail sales on decline. Third straight quarter, I think, of recession in terms of GDP data out of Hong Kong. And so this certainly could have been expected. They've been suffering for a while in terms of the riots and the impact that that's had. Now, let's talk about over the weekend. Top White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow said that Sunday, he said it's not positive in reference to the economic situation in the coming months, and said that we're entering into what he called a transitional period, and we have got to get through the next month or two. We talked about jobs already, what to keep an eye on this week. I'm curious, as you mentioned, in terms of the markets, you mentioned international markets. Do you think that they need to continue to take it in stride over the next couple months in order for us to, at the very least, remain off those March lows? I mean, ultimately, is it going to take conditions weakening for revisiting of those lows? And as long as conditions can remain the same or potentially start to get better, I mean, ultimately can hold off of revisiting those extreme lower levels.
Yeah, again, the numbers that we're seeing, Ben, they're rear view numbers, right? They're what has happened over the last month,
right?
The last quarter here. So obviously that is very, reflected upon world economies pretty much shutting down. So, moving forward here, again, I think the key for me really is to see the gradual reopening that we're seeing, not only here, but Spain is reopening now. Parts of Europe are starting to reopen. And we're not going to be able to tell overnight. We're not going to be able to tell in a week or 2 weeks from now. But a month from now, we might be able to start telling, okay, how did the reopening, not only just affect those economies, but in terms of, again, the sheer number of deaths or illnesses, is it getting worse? And if it's not getting worse,
Yeah.
to me, that is a very, very positive sign.
Yeah, Scott, we're running out of time. I spent a little too much time on the fundamentals. I wanted to get a little bit more thoughts from you in terms of some of the technicals, in terms of some of the products. If you could just tell us as far as, I mean, obviously crude oil, a big week in terms of inventories, in terms of demand concerns, storage headlines should be watched. We've got rates with Bank of England, RBA reporting this week. Treasuries here in the U.S. as we build up into the jobs report. Gold, it's been teetering around 1,700. I mean, even Bitcoin's starting to come back into the headlines with a bit of a recent rally. Which of those markets you're going to be watching most closely, and do you have the most close ties to right now in terms of a skin in the game?
Yeah, I think crude, which you and Stephanie broke down incredibly well, crude and gas prices are front and center for everybody. That's retail. That's Main Street, right? Underneath that, though, I think you have to look at gold. You have to look at the dollar. Bitcoin, I'm not looking at so much because with the halving, such a hard word to pronounce, coming up next week, I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen there. And I don't think there's any fundamental analysis about the overall market tied to Bitcoin. So really the oil market and gold and the dollar are the three keys that I'm really watching over the next couple weeks.
All right, Scott, if you are, we are. Really appreciate you joining us. Thanks for giving us part of your Monday morning and the beginning of your week. Traders, Scott Bauer is the CEO of Prosper Trading Academy. He's helping us get dialed in on the fundamentals.